Deindustrialization, suburbanization, and mass incarceration, and the decline of black baseball players. Deindustrialization, suburbanization, and going to the suburbs, the trend to move to the suburbs, and mass incarceration, and the decline of black baseball players. And obviously, we can't kind of talk about sports without referencing the Kaepernick phenomenon, et cetera. So, Dave, good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Tom. How are you?
Good, doing good, man. So, just briefly, tell people about the Dave and Beaks. We're going to play your podcast as we conclude the show, but I want people to know about your versatility.
Well, thank you. The Dave and Beaks podcast is a sports podcast mixed in with hip hop. We do politics, we do sports. It's almost like a Hot 97 in NPR. So I'm David Canton. I do all the information content points, and my producer Jerry Beaks, he handles all the hip hop lyrics and all the drops and all the technical aspects of the show. We started this summer, and the reason when I watch a lot of watch and listen a lot of talk radio and sports talk, and I believe in my academic training and in my history, my love of talk radio, we bring a different perspective.
There you go.
In terms of we look at particularly race and sports. That many of the individuals, and again, not knocking journalists, but again, have had the historical training or their analysis is pretty much not as deep as it can go. So we try to do something different. We throw the hip hop in there with lyrics that are connected to the topics of the day, and we find that it's a passion of ours, and we're just trying to build up this base. Hopefully, people will tune into the podcast after they hear my voice this morning.
Absolutely, and we'll include the podcast link on. We send out on SoundCloud and we're Facebook Live now and the Tom Ficklin various internet kind of locations where people can find it. So we'll promote the show, and just the cross-fertilization and the creativity that's occurring throughout the nation is really so key for us to beat the drum, as the black newspapers talked about in 1827. Dave, let's jump right in. We had an article in Truth Out magazine, which is online as well as hard copy. And I was really impressed with the title, Deja Vu All Over Again, Racism, Poverty, and Militarism, 50 Years Later. And you're referencing Martin Luther King's comments at that point and then how it intersects today. But unpack that for me a little bit.
Okay, great question. So as we know, next year, April 4th, 2018, is the golden anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. We also know this year, the 50th anniversary of his most popular book, but not well studied, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? So what I did, I looked at the book. I'm turning 50 next year in June, and put it all together and say, well, you know what? During the last portion of Dr. King's career, he was extremely anti-Vietnam War. There was no doubt about it. He made a decision. He said there's a moral conscience, and that I'm willing to go against President Lyndon B. Johnson, who supported the civil rights movement more so out of pressure. People always get that mixed up. Out of pressure, he supported the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and that many of Dr. King's close advisors viewed that as a wrong move. Practical politics. If you go against the war, the money stops coming for the Southern Christian Leadership Council, SCLC, and now we're on the other side. But Dr. King could not do it. But he also realized all the funding that went to the Vietnam War weren't able to provide the funding for the Great Society programs. So in 2017, the United States been fighting this war on terror for the last 16 years, has spent billions of dollars, and we're at the same problem all over again. There's not enough money to fund social programs. Now you don't want to fund healthcare, public education, infrastructure, job training, jobs. We have the same correlation. So you have it with militarism. We have racism. We see that, yes, there's been racial progress. There's no doubt about it. Look at all the statistical measures. But at the same time, there's a persistence of discrimination in the job market. So there's still discrimination, a persistence of it. So again, these things are not static. It's not the same, no, quote unquote, no Negroes apply, no Latinos apply. You can apply, but we're going to look at your resume and still put it to the side if your name is Tyrone or Shaniqua.
And there have been a number of studies evidencing that.
Sure, tons of studies. So these are what we call the structural realities of America. So if we're looking at it 50 years ago, 50 years forward, we're still dealing with the same structural problems. But unfortunately for many citizens, we look at America as individuals. We don't understand how structures and institutions work. That's why we're still having the same problem, whether it's Kaepernick or the two brothers from 68 in Mexico City 50 years next year. So it's the same problem.
Tommy Smith, and John Carlos. So you're referencing then institutional racism.
Correct. Correct. So in other words, 50 years ago, Dr. King's book, there's another book by Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael called Black Power. And of course, the Kerner Commission, which came out after the riots of 1967. All three books talked about institutional racism. The Kerner Commission talked about police brutality and stop and frisk in the 1960s. So in other words, 50 years ago, these books outline institutional racism, institutional sexism. All these structural things were in the system. They recognized that. But unfortunately, in our culture, we address things through reform, that we think once a law or once one or two people get in, or we can say there's a black president, there's a black professor. Yes, that's true, but we look at it statistically in the structures. You see that there's a persistence of racism. Persistence, these things continue because they're in the structure and the cultural DNA of the country. So Dr. King, when he organized the Poor People's March, was trying to address poverty. Poverty is as real as apple pie. There are more poor white people than black people. Let me say that one more time. There are more poor white people, in fact, double the number of poor white people than black people. So when they cut health care, more poor whites are suffering than black people. But unfortunately, we've racialized poverty. So when we think about poverty as some black person running through your head. When we think about welfare as some black woman with 17,000 kids running through your head. But the reality is there's more poor white people. That means there's more poor white women on SNAP, sliding EBT cards. There's more poor white men hooked up on opioids and need treatment.
Yes, we see that crisis, absolutely.
You see what I'm saying? But we racialize poverty. See? So what will happen, you have poor whites voting against their interests and tricked. You see? And then on the flip side for African Americans, unfortunately for some of us, we've internalized, right? That there's people in the black community that are keeping black people back. Because of them, if they don't pull their pants up, we'll move ahead. That has no relation to the data, right? Yes, there are individuals that, every individual needs help, but the systemic racism, the persistence of discrimination, the lack of opportunity, lack of livable wage jobs, those are the issues that are hurting African Americans. Yes, you applaud all the self-help issues, but the structure, programs, all that costs money. All of that. You see, and that's
and you're suggesting that there is enough money per se, but it's the allocation and the distribution of it.
Of course, the will. Taxing corporations, increasing the taxes on the wealthy. There's not enough revenue coming into the federal government. That's the problem. There's not enough revenue coming in to pay for these programs. Also, where 60% of the U.S. budget goes to the military.
But that's what I mean. I hear you saying if the military expenditures were reduced.
Makes a difference. If you look at the national federal budget, you'll find that education, and they get less than 10% of the federal budget. 60% goes to the federal for the defense. The United States spends more than the next 8 industrialized nations on military.
Say that again.
The United States spends more than the next 8 industrialized nations on the military. So that's why when you're in the military, you like Republicans, you're going to get a pay raise, right? There's more empathy, more sympathy. It seems like they're more patriotic. You get a 2% bump, right? But of course, also those that make weapons, they benefit. The contractors make money, like Halliburton, Dick Cheney. Of course, they love that 60%. But the reality is, for a lot of other people, they're suffering. And when people say, with no health care, you're going to die, stop being literal. For some people, it's over time when you don't get your medication. You can't go down. You're not going to die that day. Some people do, but it's metaphoric. We know in the long term, when one doesn't have health care, it's not going to end up in a good position, particularly if you're poor and low income, when we know obesity and all these other preventable diseases are connected to what? Poverty, whether you're black or you're white.
That's right. Listen to the Tom Ficklin Show, and really a pleasure to have Dave Canton with us. David Canton is the associate professor of history and director of the Africana Studies program at Conn College. The article that he was referencing, "Deja Vu All Over Again: Racism, Poverty, and Militarism 50 Years Later," we'll include that cited that notation also in the website, because it's really good. You've just, believe it or not, listeners, he's just covered maybe 1/10 of what's in this article. So you gotta read this article. Really key. Let's before we move to another subject, you want to chat any more about that?
Well, yeah. Well, two things. Obviously, read the essay, and also just start to think about how we change our thinking about when they say what we do for Africa. I think it's a two-pronged solution. It's always have been. Of course, continuing one does in local community organizations, but also changing how one's perspective, and that it's not that African Americans are not trying, it's these systemic realities.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, we talk about wealth gaps, health gaps,
Mm-hmm.
and people have to be clear on the question. If you want to solve the wealth gap, you need policies.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean? Now, if you want to increase your savings as an individual, that talks about cut out buying coffee every day, cut out your cable. That will increase your savings. But we also know many people living check to check when you're low income. So it's not that folks don't want to create wealth. They don't have the mechanism. So you need policies. When we talk about health gaps, you need health insurance, health care. You need healthy food options.
Mm-hmm.
Now, individuals can cut down on their French fries, can walk more. Of course you can. But there are many folks working 2-3 low-paying jobs that don't have time. That's systemic. If you increase the to make a livable wage, I can work less hours. I have spent time so I can walk and exercise. So you want to be clear about, when we talk about closing gaps, that takes policies.
Mm-hmm.
When you're talking about individual efforts of doing things, that's what people are doing. So you have to combine the two, because what happens is you just get frustrated and just get mad at black people. Black people not doing this. Black people not doing that. Yes, they are doing it. But what are you doing on the systemic side? Calling Congress people, calling politicians, voting, engaging, reading, having discussions, and just thinking about these issues in a larger way.
And in fact, just as you said that, Dave, you were involved with, correct me if I'm wrong, some young people in the NAACP youth, and you had an event. I think that from my read, but I don't want to interpret it for you. That was a way for them to work on their tactics and strategies and become active and aware of what's going on in the world. So share a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, this year is the 100th anniversary of the Greater New Haven chapter of the NAACP, and also 100th year anniversary of the silent protest parade in Harlem by the NAACP. So what we know is that lynching was a major issue in the South after slavery. So it's funny, during slavery, there's no lynching numbers. I wonder why. Needed the labor. But as soon as 1865 kicks in, all of a sudden numbers go up. So the same guy who was childlike, docile, we don't need to lynch that person. But all of a sudden, when they're free, now he's a beast ready to go out and rape white women. So we have to control that under this ban of, quote unquote, protecting white womanhood. So we find that 4,000 African Americans have been lynched in this country. Was documented. I think in the South now, the Southern poverty law center, if I'm not mistaken, they're having a memorial for the victims of lynching in this country. So more people died through lynching than who died on the 9/11 attacks. But unfortunately, in our nation's history, with amnesia, there's never a time to take time out to recognize how African Americans, some of them even World War II soldiers, were lynched in uniform, because for many white Americans that was just not should happen. How could a black person be a citizen? So basically, we said 100 years later that, again, like I've always been preaching, that it's the same systemic issues. Voter suppression 2.0, 2017, dealing with that again. Police brutality, still dealing with that. That's a long issue in this nation's history. So you celebrate these years to recognize where you've been. Yes, we have a black mayor in New Haven. There's a black police chief. There's all these black middle-class folks doing great. But we know systemically, even amongst the black middle class, the wealth gap, many being denied promotions, we still see that persistence of discrimination. So young people have to understand and have the analytical tools to see, because again, like I said before, if you don't, you just get frustrated and angry that black people aren't doing anything. They just wait on the government. They're lazy. The reality is that black folks have always done something, but this persistence of discrimination, racism, sexism, classism, these other things are realities that you have to, again, fight at the same time.
Again, in the article that David's referencing, deja vu all over again, racism, poverty, and militarism 50 years later in Truth Out magazine, which is really worth kind of taking a look at as well. You also, Dave, I mean, you've been doing a lot of writing, man. You've been earning picking some cotton here.
Yeah.
Pick a little bit of cotton.
Yeah, that op-ed program, pretty much, we had to basically show how to get, there's so many blogs, the beauty of social media, so many outlets now that people put out ideas. So this was an opportunity to write some of these essays and get on these different platforms and get your ideas out there.
Boy, tremendous. Let's talk about, again, you're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show, and David Canton is with us. But Ebony, speaking of platforms, I mean, that's a platform that's been around for a while, and the case for compensating college basketball players, as we know, the basketball season is starting, and you say some provocative things in there also, from my standpoint, in terms of economics and skill sets and businesses and who owns who, and your freedom of speech and freedom of activity, and also how one gets, whether you're earning money for others and not getting rewarded for it. So the case for compensating college basketball players.
Well, we know just recently, 4 African-American male coaches were in a sting with the FBI, almost like the show The Wire, where they got these African-American individuals getting cash to lead these young African-American male players to these sneaker contracts. So we know this is $1 billion industry. So whenever something becomes an industry, for instance, the military-industrial complex after World War II, the prison industrial complex in as early as the 1960s, the drug industrial complex, opioids. So it's no different with college athletics. Now, again, it varies in degrees, whether it's the water polo team, the field hockey team. In each sport, there's a culture of how they recruit top talent. Now, the gifts are different. They vary. If you're a top swimmer, you're being competed against other top elite schools. My argument is that we all know what produces the revenue: college men's basketball and college football, period. There's no discussion. There's no debate. Most men's sports don't make money. Nobody's interested in the shooting team at Ohio State. You know, there's a shooting team at Ohio State. Nobody's watching that. The men's soccer team at Utah, nobody cares. We all know Big Ten Network, Pac-12 Network, all those big Power 5 conferences, it was because of football, period, and basketball. So as a college athlete, they get full tuition, you get the tutoring, and they get stipends. They get a monthly check because they can't work. So if you're on the lacrosse team, female lacrosse team at University of Maryland, you might get $800 a month. Now, keep in mind, what people don't understand, most students who play D1 football and basketball are second-generation college students. Let me repeat that. This whole Allen Iverson myth of from the hood, that's a minority. Shaquille O'Neal's sons going to college. All these kids' parents attended college. So when you look at the field hockey team at Ohio State, they're upper middle class. So the $800 a month is just cherry on top, and I can ask mom and dad for $2,000. You see what I mean? The water polo. Now, if you're a first-gen student, I read a good piece by a Latino woman. I forgot what school. I forgot what sport she played, but she talked about it. She was receiving $1,100 a month to play on a particular team. I forgot. It's a great piece. So the reality is they're getting a stipend. However, those sports don't produce revenue. Now let's look at coaches' salaries. Look at football and basketball. Yes. Jim Harbaugh, the coach of Michigan, makes $9 million. He's the #1 paid public employee in Michigan. And Flint, you can't get clean water.
More than the president, yeah.
Come on now, you can't get clean water in Flint. Rick Pitino, who just finally caught up with him, who resigned with the scandal at his school, was making $7 million. Auburn University, Chuck Person, an assistant coach, was making $240,000 a year, was caught doing the in the sting. His head coach, his boss, makes $1.5 million. So look at the gap. He's doing the same amount of work to get the brothers to recruit, to talk to other brothers, but he's making $800,000 less. So I can see why he took some of that money. He's doing the same job. And you know, to become a head coach, how racist it is, it's hard to get in the game. So if I get these top players and we win, then I become a head coach and make $1 million. The starting average salary for these Power 5 coaches in basketball. So my argument is these football players and basketball players need what you call a stipend, a payment, whatever language you want to use. They need to get more money. Or the worst case, these coaches should get paid no more than an administrator. They make money from TV shows, sneaker contracts. There's all types of deals in this. It's so corrupt, this industry. So now the NC2A and Condoleezza Rice is on this committee, is saying we want to check out this system that's unfair. Unfair to whom? Not the coaches. It's unfair to the players. So they're even asking the wrong question. So they're still at the same question. They're not getting paid. You see what I mean? So my thing is pay them, increase that stipend. I don't know if when they leave you get $20,000 or minimum free tuition forever. Because if you don't graduate, I should be able to walk into the Ohio State, to the bursar's office. That's where you pay, big word, that's where you pay your money. Oh, that's Dave Canton. He played in 2012. He gets in for free, no fees, no how. If I want to live on the campus for free, I should at minimum get that. But that's what's wrong with that industry. White male coaches, most of them are making millions of dollars off the labor of these black athletes in football and basketball.
So you see the connection when people talk about sometimes sports being a plantation. You see a connection there.
Without a doubt. There's a book by William Roden, $40 Million Slaves. Now this is the key. When you talk about slavery, folks, it's about power. So the reality is, of course, LeBron James is not enslaved in that sense, right? Many people don't realize that there's a gentleman by the name of Curt Flood. He played for the St. Louis Cardinals. And in sports, they have what's called the reserve clause. So players had no say in where they can go. So he challenged that in 1975 with the when St. Louis said, you know, Curt, we're going to send you to the Philadelphia Phillies. Now, remember, Philadelphia was a racist town, big time. He said, I don't want to go to Philadelphia. Well, you had no choice. So the argument is the plantation is you have white owners who control the means of production, i.e. the stadiums, the large revenues, and that the players, the laborers, predominantly black in football and basketball. And that's what we have. It's about power. You see what I mean? So the reality is that, yes, these players have power because they can make a choice. You see what I mean? You don't have to play, right? There's free agency. But the argument is that the optics of it. So when Jerry Jones says you must do X, you say, wait a minute, 13th Amendment, my friend, 1865. And since you're in Texas, it's called Juneteenth. You see what I mean? So it's about power. He's exerting power. Now, I'm not enslaved. I have power to say yay and nay. And of course, you're going to say, well, that's an employer. Well, most jobs, you don't have to stand for no Pledge of Allegiance or sing a song. Why is it in public events? You see, my argument is what we need to do for the veterans is increase their benefits.
Okay, so let's just jump to Kaepernick since you've jumped there, and we'll still try to cover the other two articles as well, because certainly this has been in the news and the sustained attention on and great media attention and really great national attention on either side of where people have various perspectives and subtle and not so subtle ideologies about what's occurring. But the Kaepernick phenomenon is really fascinating.
Well, really, it's not really much aside from me, right? The reality is, this is America. The last I checked, it was a democracy. Now, I just read last week in China, China is censoring that internet censorship, and the Russians want to do the same thing. You see, in other words, in China, they're saying now, we want to control Facebook, control censor. That's China, and Russia wants to do the same. Now, Putin's a great friend of Trump. You see, but in America, what I've studied is a democracy. And when did the flag only meant for one group of people, the veterans? Yes, they go out and put their life on the line. But freedom we all participate in freedom. This show is about freedom and democracy.
Absolutely.
The truck driver that brings your cereal from New York to Miami, the freedom of choice to have 15,000 types of cereals when you go to Stop and Shop plays a part in freedom. Educators, to make you aware and be thinking critically so you become an informed voter. So we all play a role in this. So I can take a knee at the flag to protest the NRA and not supporting the gun lobby. I can take a knee because I'm upset that the government won't support Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands aid effort. So there's so many issues. I can stand for the flag because I like the progress the country made. That's fine. But that's called America. That's choices. So this whole public display of patriotism based on the national anthem is all phony, and it's a fraud. And at the same time, you're saying stand up, but you're cutting benefits for poor people in healthcare. We don't support the VA hospitals like we should. The veterans who have PTSD not getting treated, don't have a job. Let's get to the real issue. Stop doing symbols, as Reverend William Barber said. Let's do statutes. You see what I mean? So for me, if I go to a game, you sit down, I have no problem with it. You stand up, put your hat on, hat off. Let's get to real stuff, not this symbolic stuff. But the reality is that President 45 understands that his base buys into symbols. You see what I mean? Let's make America great again. That's a code word. Let's make America white again. Nationalism, patriotism. Let's go back to the 50s of patriarchy, of women staying at home, black folks in the back of the bus, gay and lesbian people just don't exist, don't matter. That's what they buy into. So it's up to us to understand that and do something about it.
And Dave, you're here to kind of help us understand it and to do something about it as well. And again, this is the Tom Ficklin Show, and Dave Canton is my guest. Dave, in terms of Kaepernick, bring people up to date a little bit about his exercising the legal system.
Right. So as of today, he's going to file a grievance against the NFL for collusion. So basically what collusion is in sports. So we have 30 NFL teams. So there's no document. The owners didn't meet in a room with the GMs and said on a dotted line. There's no email. There's no Facebook link. It's all a wink, wink, and a gun and an understanding. Don't sign this guy. We've done studies with our base. We think that they will not show up. They will send us thousands of emails. It will disrupt our flow of money. We all know that Kaepernick, without a doubt, can play in this league. If you go through the rosters of these quarterbacks in the NFL, you find out two things. There's a culture of backup quarterbacks, mostly white, and they can't play. But what do? They come to work on time. They hold a clipboard, don't say anything, and get that check and then get that pension. And you're telling me Colin Kaepernick can't hold a clipboard, come on time? You telling me he can't do that? Yes, he can. But the reality is their fear, he'll disrupt the cash flow of the organization, a quote-unquote distraction. Now, it's funny. The Miami Dolphins owner, Stephen Ross, last year supported Kaepernick. Now, this year, doesn't support him because, again, he's heard from his friends, his peers, emails, Facebook. Remember, fans call, and that's what people don't understand, the power of calling in. I was listening to a radio show. A guy worked for a team and said, you know what? They had to hire him at ESPN. I think it was ESPN when Jamel Hill got suspended for 2 weeks. People call in. They had to hire extra people to take phone calls that voiced their displeasure with her comments about Jerry Jones, and people should boycott or not support the NFL.
So what did the Dallas Cowboys, what did Jerry Jones say?